They picked the wrong homeowner. Let me say that again, because I want it to land. They picked the wrong homeowner, not the wrong neighbor, not the wrong family, the wrong human being to mess with. And by the time this story is over, you're going to understand exactly why those 6 words changed everything. 156 violation notices. I want you to stop for a second and actually feel that number. Not read it. Feel it. 156 yellow envelopes. 156 times I walked to my mailbox with hope. Maybe it's a package. Maybe it's a card from someone. Maybe it's just a bill. And instead found another piece of paper telling me that something about my home, my property, my life was not good enough for them. Every single week for 3 years straight. Do you know what that does to a person? Do you know what it does to a family? It starts small. The first notice, you're confused. The second one, you're annoyed. By the 10th, you're frustrated. By the 30th, you're exhausted. By the 50th, you start questioning yourself. Am I the problem? Am I actually doing something wrong? By the 100th, something darker sets in. You start dreading your own mailbox. You start feeling a knot in your stomach every time you pull into your own driveway. The place that was supposed to be your safe place, your sanctuary, starts feeling like a trap. My mailbox became a weapon. That's not a metaphor. That's not me being dramatic for YouTube. That is the honest, lived reality of what systematic HOA harassment feels like. They turned a piece of metal attached to a post in front of my house into something I genuinely feared. I drive home from a long day of work, turn onto my street, and feel my chest tighten before I even park the car. My wife noticed it before I did. She told me one night, "You flinch when you check the mail now. You didn't used to do that." She was right. I did. My weekends became battles. Saturday mornings used to mean something to me. Coffee on the porch, cartoons with my kids, maybe a project in the backyard. Normal life. Good life. The kind of life you work a decade to build. But somewhere in year 1 of this nightmare, my weekends transformed into legal research sessions, appeal letter drafting, photo documentation walks around my own property, and phone calls with neighbors comparing violation notices like we were trading terrible baseball cards. I stopped resting on weekends. I started preparing. Because with this HOA board, if you weren't ready, you were going to get hit with something new by Monday morning. My home, the place I saved for 11 years to buy, started feeling like a prison. 11 years. I need you to understand what 11 years of saving looks like. It looks like skipping vacations. It looks like driving a car with 140,000 miles because a car payment would set back the down payment fund. It looks like brown bag lunches every single day at work while coworkers go out. It looks like spreadsheets on Saturday nights calculating how many more months until you have enough. 11 years of discipline, sacrifice, and delayed gratification, all pointed toward one goal. A home. My home. A place that belonged to me. And for 3 years, a 5-person board of self-appointed neighborhood bureaucrats systematically tried to make me feel like it didn't. Like I was a guest in my own house. Like I was always one yellow envelope away from being reminded that they were in charge, not me. Like my home, the thing I bled and scraped and saved for, was actually theirs to control. That feeling is something I wouldn't wish on anyone. But here's the moment everything changed. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no lightning bolt. No movie scene. It was a Tuesday evening in October, and I was sitting at my kitchen table with a binder, a literal 3-ring binder, that was now so full of violation notices, appeal letters, fine receipts, and correspondence that I had to buy a second one. I sat there looking at those 2 binders, and I had a choice to make. Option 1. I could keep fighting the same fight. Keep appealing. Keep documenting. Keep paying fines I didn't owe for violations that weren't real, hoping that eventually they'd get tired or make a mistake big enough to take to court. Option 2. I could sell. Pack up. Take the loss. Move somewhere without an HOA and never look back. Plenty of people had told me to do exactly that. It's not worth it. Just leave. Find somewhere better. And I want to be honest with you. I considered it. There were nights I was so worn down, so tired, so beaten up by the whole thing that leaving felt like the only sane option left. But then I thought about every person in my neighborhood who was going through the same thing, and didn't have the energy or the knowledge to fight back. I thought about the retired couple 3 houses down who'd been fined so many times they'd stopped opening the envelopes. I thought about the young family across the street who were months away from just surrendering and selling at a loss. I thought about what this board would keep doing to them, to future homeowners, to whoever moved into my house next, if someone didn't stop them. And I made option 3. I didn't hire a lawyer, not because I couldn't, not because I didn't want to, but because I realized something that most homeowners never figure out. The law was already on my side. I didn't need someone to fight for me in a courtroom. I needed to understand the system well enough to beat them from the inside. I didn't move out because this was my home. My name was on the deed. My kids grew up in that backyard. My wife planted those flowers by the front door. You don't abandon something you built with 11 years of your life because 5 people on a volunteer board decided to make you their target. I didn't give up. And that, right there, is the part that cost them everything. Because when you push someone past exhaustion, past frustration, past anger, and all the way into cold, quiet, focused determination, you've created something you cannot stop. I ran for their board. I knocked on doors. I had conversations. I built relationships with neighbors who'd been suffering in silence for years. I studied Tennessee HOA law until I could recite statutes in my sleep. I documented every illegal fine, every procedural violation, every instance of selective enforcement and financial mismanagement. I prepared for that annual meeting the way a lawyer prepares for the biggest case of their career. I won. Not barely. Not in a close vote. In a landslide, because I wasn't just one angry homeowner anymore. I was the voice of an entire neighborhood that had been waiting for someone to finally stand up. And then I burned the whole thing down legally. Within 60 days of taking that board seat, we put a dissolution vote in front of every homeowner in Maplewood Estates. The evidence was overwhelming. The support was undeniable. And when the votes were counted, the Maplewood Estates HOA, the organization that had terrorized this neighborhood for years, that had sent me 156 violation notices, that had taken thousands of dollars from families who just wanted to live in peace, was gone, dissolved, finished, done. Every fine wiped, every pending notice canceled, every ounce of power that board had accumulated over years of bullying, gone overnight. This is that story. And I'm telling it for a reason, not for revenge, not for clout, not to make Gerald Hoffman's life harder than it already is now. I'm telling it because somewhere out there, right now, someone is sitting at their kitchen table looking at a yellow envelope and feeling exactly what I felt. Powerless, exhausted, alone. And I need that person to hear this before we go any further. You are not powerless. You are not alone. And they picked the wrong homeowner too. Stay with me, because it's about to get very, very good. That I end 2019. Marcus Reed bought his first home. For words that don't even come close to capturing what that moment actually meant. Because it wasn't just a real estate transaction. It wasn't just a mortgage approval and a set of keys handed over a closing table. For Marcus Reed, buying that house was the finish line of a race he'd been running since he was 24 years old, broke, ambitious, and absolutely certain that one day he was going to own something that was truly, completely, undeniably his. That day finally came on a Thursday morning in April, and when Marcus turned the key in the front door of 114 Birchwood Lane, Maplewood Estates, Tennessee, for the first time in his adult life, he exhaled. The house was everything he'd worked for. 3 bedrooms, a backyard big enough for a garden and a playset, a 2-car garage that still smelled like fresh paint, hardwood floors throughout the main level, a kitchen with enough counter space that his wife, Dana, actually teared up a little when she saw it, because for 7 years they'd been cooking in apartments where 2 people couldn't stand side by side without bumping elbows. And the porch. Marcus had a specific, almost embarrassingly simple dream about that porch. Nothing grand, nothing complicated. He just wanted to sit there on Saturday mornings with a cup of coffee, watch the neighborhood wake up, and feel the particular kind of peace that only comes when you know, deeply, completely know, that the ground beneath your feet belongs to you. That was the dream. That was what 11 years of sacrifice looked like when it finally took physical form. A porch, a coffee cup, and silence. Maplewood Estates looked perfect on paper. And honestly, in those first few weeks, it looked pretty perfect in person too. The streets were clean and wide. The lawns were maintained with a consistency that suggested either genuine pride or quiet competition among neighbors, maybe both. There was a community pool at the center of the development that the kids immediately claimed as their favorite place on earth. The neighbors Marcus met in those early days were warm, friendly, the kind of people who waved from driveways and remembered your name after one introduction. It felt like the kind of neighborhood you see in movies, the kind that makes you think, yes, this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. There was, of course, a homeowners association. The Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association had been in place since the development was built in 2003. When Marcus received the HOA documentation packet during closing, he sat down and read every page, all 47 of them. Lawn maintenance standards, exterior paint color guidelines, rules about holiday decorations, fence heights, driveway materials, and trash bin placement. Marcus wasn't bothered. He was, by nature and by habit, a rule follower. He respected structure. He understood that shared communities needed shared standards. He signed the acknowledgement form, filed the documents in a folder, and genuinely believed that was the last time the HOA would ever be a significant part of his life. He was not a man who cut corners. He was not a man who caused problems. He paid his dues on time, maintained his property meticulously, and extended every neighbor the same basic dignity he expected in return. In Marcus Reed's mind, the HOA was simply background noise, administrative wallpaper, a boring but necessary part of community living that would never actually touch his day-to-day life. That belief, reasonable, rational, and completely wrong, was the first domino. What he didn't know was that the HOA board of Maplewood Estates wasn't interested in rules. They were interested in power. Board President Gerald Hoffman had held his position for 6 consecutive years without a single contested election. In a neighborhood of over 200 households, HOA board meetings typically drew between 8 and 12 attendees, mostly retirees with time to spare and a genuine interest in community governance. Gerald had built his authority quietly, incrementally, the way certain personalities always do, not through excellence or vision, but through the simple willingness to show up when everyone else didn't bother. He was a man who had discovered, relatively late in life, that he enjoyed telling people what to do, and the HOA gave him the perfect vehicle to do exactly that, with just enough legal cover to make it feel legitimate. Gerald had spent 6 years cultivating a board of 4 additional members who shared his disposition toward control. They met monthly in the community center, armed with clipboards, governing documents, and a carefully maintained sense of institutional authority. They issued fines. They rejected appeals. They approved or denied exterior modification requests based on criteria that shifted depending on who was asking. Longtime residents had learned to navigate Gerald's board the way you navigate a difficult coworker, carefully, strategically, with as little direct confrontation as possible. Most people found it easier to just comply, pay the occasional fine, and avoid drawing attention. What nobody in Maplewood Estates had ever done was push back. Not really. Not systematically. Not with the kind of focused, documented, legally grounded resistance that actually threatens the foundation of what men like Gerald Hoffman build. So when a new family moved into 114, Birchwood Lane that April, a quiet, organized, deeply principled man who read every rule in the packet and genuinely believed in fairness, Gerald Hoffman saw exactly what he always saw when new homeowners arrived. Fresh territory, an unfamiliar face, with no established relationships, no knowledge of the board's history, and no understanding yet of how things really worked in Maplewood Estates. What Gerald did not see, what he was completely, catastrophically incapable of seeing, was the specific kind of man Marcus Reed actually was. The kind who keeps records, the kind who reads the law, the kind who, once pushed far enough, doesn't just push back, he dismantles the whole machine. It started 3 weeks after Marcus moved in. Not months. Not after some long honeymoon period where the neighborhood welcomed him in and gave him a chance to settle. 3 weeks. 21 days after Marcus Reed carried the last moving box through the front door of 114, Birchwood Lane. Before he'd even finished unpacking the spare bedroom, the HOA made its first move. A yellow envelope in the mailbox. Marcus almost didn't open it immediately. He'd just gotten home from a long day. Dana was finishing dinner. The kids were loud and happy and racing through the hallway like they always did in those first golden weeks of a new home. Life felt good. Life felt normal. Life felt like exactly what he'd worked 11 years to build. He stood at the mailbox, flipped through the envelopes, a water bill, a furniture catalog, something from the mortgage company, and then stopped at the yellow one. Official letterhead, formal font, the words violation notice printed across the top in bold. His stomach dropped, not dramatically, just that small, quiet sinking feeling you get when something interrupts the peace you were just enjoying a second ago. He read it standing right there at the mailbox. His trash bin had been visible from the street on a non-designated trash day. Specifically, it had been left at the curb approximately 4 hours past the permitted retrieval window on a Tuesday afternoon. Under Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the Maplewood Estates HOA Community Standards, this constituted a visible nuisance violation. Fine $50, payable within 14 days. Marcus stood there for a long moment. Then he did something that, looking back, tells you everything you need to know about the kind of man he is. He didn't get angry. He didn't call anybody. He didn't post about it online. He went inside, pulled out his HOA documentation folder, found Section 7, Paragraph 3, and read it carefully. The rule was real. He had, technically, left the bin out longer than permitted. He'd gotten home late that Tuesday, gotten caught up with the kids, and simply forgotten to pull it back until after dinner. Marcus paid the $50 fine online that same evening. He moved the bin to the garage. He set a recurring phone reminder for every trash day. Retrieve bin by 6 p.m. and considered the matter closed. That was week 1. Week 2 brought another yellow envelope. This time, the violation was his mailbox post. According to the notice, the post had been repainted at some point by a previous owner using a white that did not match the community-approved shade. Specifically, Sherwin-Williams Alabaster White, Code SW 7008. The current color was described in the notice as an unapproved off-white variant that violated Section 12 of the Exterior Standards Guidelines. Fine, $75. Marcus pulled out the documentation again, found Section 12, read the paint specifications, looked at his mailbox post, which, to every human eye including his own, appeared to be a perfectly normal shade of white, and accepted that somewhere in the bureaucratic universe, there existed a meaningful difference between his post's current color and Sherwin-Williams SW 7008. He didn't argue. He ordered the correct paint online, repainted the post that weekend, submitted photo documentation to the HOA email address confirming compliance, and paid the $75. He was mildly annoyed. But still, 2 notices in 2 weeks, both technically rooted in real rules, both resolved quickly. Marcus told himself this was just the HOA establishing that they ran a tight ship. He could respect that. He'd follow the rules even more carefully going forward. That reasoning lasted exactly 7 days. Week 3. The welcome mat. Marcus received a violation notice informing him that the mat placed at his front entrance was non-compliant with community aesthetic standards under Section 9, Paragraph 1, which prohibited exterior decor items that were excessively decorative, commercially branded, or otherwise inconsistent with the neighborhood's visual uniformity. His welcome mat said home on it in simple block letters. Neutral colors. Nothing unusual. Dana had picked it up from a home goods store for $14. Fine $50. This time, Marcus felt something sharper than mild annoyance. He reread Section 9 3 times. The language was vague enough to mean almost anything, and specific enough to be used against almost anyone. He replaced the mat with a plain brown one, paid the fine, and for the first time allowed himself to wonder whether something more deliberate was happening. He decided to address it directly. A neighborhood barbecue that Saturday gave him the perfect opportunity. Marcus spotted Gerald Hoffman holding court near the grill, a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s with the particular confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged in his own environment. Neighbors orbited him with the careful, slightly deferential energy of people who had learned which way the wind blew. Marcus approached with a smile, introduced himself properly, extended his hand. Gerald shook it warmly, asked how the family was settling in. complimented the neighborhood in the way people do when they consider themselves personally responsible for its condition. Marcus kept his tone friendly and light. He mentioned the 3 notices, said he'd resolved all of them immediately, and simply asked, "Is there a better way to communicate directly? If something's ever an issue, I'd rather just talk it through than go through formal notices." Gerald smiled, a slow, practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The rules apply to everyone equally," he said. Then he turned back to the grill. The conversation was over. Marcus walked back across the yard slowly, replaying those 6 words in his head. Not what Gerald said, but how he said it. The complete absence of warmth behind the smile. The slight emphasis on everyone that somehow managed to mean the opposite. It wasn't a reassurance. It was a warning. The following Monday, Marcus opened his mailbox and found 2 violation notices inside a single yellow envelope. And somewhere in Gerald Hoffman's mind, a game had officially begun. What Gerald couldn't know, was that Marcus Reed had just quietly decided to start keeping score. What followed was not a dispute, not a disagreement, not a neighborly conflict that could have been resolved over a handshake and a conversation. What followed was 156 weeks of calculated, deliberate, systematic psychological warfare, waged by 5 people on a volunteer board against one family who had done nothing wrong except move into the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. And Gerald Hoffman ran it like a campaign. Year 1 started with the small things, the kind of violations so petty, so microscopic in their significance, that the only rational explanation for their existence was that someone was actively searching for them. Marcus's flower pots were cited as too colorful. Specifically, the combination of red and yellow blooms in the planters on his front steps violated a vague aesthetic harmony clause buried in Section 11 of the Community Standards. Dana had planted those flowers the first weekend they moved in. The kids had helped. It was one of the first things the family had done together to make 114 Birchwood Lane feel like theirs. They replaced the flowers with white ones, paid the fine, said nothing. 2 weeks later, Marcus received a notice about his car. Specifically, his front left tire was parked approximately 1.5 inches over the designated driveway boundary line, as defined by the property edge markers outlined in the community parking regulations. An HOA representative had apparently stood in front of his house with a measuring instrument to determine this. $75 fine. Marcus moved the car, paid the fine, started parking with the kind of precision usually reserved for aircraft carriers approaching landing strips. Then came the bicycle notice. His daughter, Lily, 8 years old, gap-toothed, obsessed with anything purple, had left her bicycle leaning against the front porch railing one afternoon after school. Not overnight, not for a weekend, for approximately 3 hours on a Wednesday afternoon before Marcus brought it inside after dinner. A formal written warning arrived 4 days later. Unattended recreational equipment left in visible exterior areas constituted a community standards violation under Section 8, Paragraph 6. Marcus read that notice 3 times. Then he set it carefully in his binder, the first binder, which was already approaching capacity, and said nothing to Dana about it that night because he didn't want to see the look on her face. By the middle of year 1, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Gerald's board wasn't enforcing rules. They were manufacturing violations. There's a fundamental difference between the two, and Marcus, who had spent months studying the HOA documentation with increasing intensity, understood it clearly. Enforcement means applying consistent standards equally across the community. What Gerald was doing was something else entirely, selectively targeting one address, applying vague and broadly written clauses with maximum aggression, and using the formal violation process as a weapon rather than a tool. Marcus began documenting everything with new intensity. Every Sunday morning, before his family was awake, he walked the perimeter of his property with his phone camera. He photographed every inch of his exterior, the lawn, the driveway, the porch, the mailbox post, the flower pots, the fence line, the garage door, the window trim. He photographed neighboring properties too, noting violations identical to ones he'd been fined for that were never cited on other streets. He created a spreadsheet. Violation date, violation description, fine amount, appeal filed, appeal outcome, resolution taken, photo evidence reference number. By the end of year 1, That spreadsheet had 52 rows. Year 2 was when the financial damage became impossible to ignore. The fines had escalated in both frequency and dollar amount. Gerald's board had discovered, or perhaps always known, that the HOA bylaws allowed fine amounts to increase for repeat violations, a clause designed to handle genuinely negligent homeowners who ignored legitimate issues. In Gerald's hands, it became a compounding machine. Marcus had now paid over $4,000 in fines. For $1,000. Not for neglect, not for genuine violations, for flower colors and bicycle placement and a welcome mat and a satellite dish, cited at one point for being mounted at what the board described as a non-standard angle inconsistent with community roofline aesthetics, a phrase Marcus was fairly certain Gerald had invented entirely on his own. The financial strain was real. Marcus and Dana had a savings plan, a careful, disciplined budget they'd maintained for years. For $1,000 wasn't catastrophic, but it was a family vacation. It was 3 months of the kids' activities. It was money that belonged to them, extracted through a process that felt less like governance and more like extortion dressed in official letterhead. But the money wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was what it did to the atmosphere inside 114 Birchwood Lane. Dana stopped decorating the porch seasonally, something she'd loved during their entire marriage, because every new decoration felt like a potential violation waiting to happen. Marcus's son, Tyler, asked one evening at dinner why they couldn't put a basketball hoop in the driveway, like his friend across town had. Marcus started to answer and then stopped, because the honest answer was too complicated and too sad to explain to a 10-year-old. The house that was supposed to be their sanctuary had developed an invisible ceiling, an invisible set of walls. Not physical ones, but psychological boundaries imposed by the constant awareness that someone was watching, measuring, and waiting. Marcus noticed it in himself most clearly during a moment in the second winter, when he was hanging Christmas lights along the roofline. A simple, joyful thing that millions of families do every December without a second thought. And he found himself stopping halfway through, standing on the ladder in the cold, mentally cross-referencing the holiday decoration guidelines in Section 14 before he continued. He was self-censoring his own Christmas lights. That was the moment Marcus understood, fully, completely understood, what Gerald Hoffman had actually been trying to accomplish all along. It wasn't about the fines. The fines were a tool, not the goal. The goal was surrender. The goal was to make Marcus Reed so exhausted, so financially drained, so psychologically worn down, that he would either sell the house and leave, or stay and become exactly the kind of compliant, head down, never cause problems homeowner that made Gerald's board feel powerful. Gerald wanted Marcus broken, and in year 2, standing on that ladder with Christmas lights in his hands, Marcus came terrifyingly close to being exactly that. Year 3 was different, not because the violations stopped, they didn't. Gerald's board sent 52 notices in year 3, consistent as clockwork, creative as ever in their manufactured justifications. But something had shifted inside Marcus Reed that no violation notice could touch. He'd spent 2 years absorbing the hits, documenting the pattern, and quietly learning everything there was to know about HOA law in Tennessee. He'd connected with a real estate attorney named Patricia Voss, who specialized in HOA disputes, not to file a lawsuit, but simply to understand the full legal landscape. What Patricia told him over 3 consultations fundamentally reframed everything. The board had been operating outside its legal authority for years. Fines issued without proper written notice periods. Appeals dismissed without the required documentation. Financial records that hadn't been made available to homeowners despite state law requiring transparency. Selective enforcement so thoroughly documented in Marcus's spreadsheets that it constituted a clear pattern of discriminatory application, legally actionable under Tennessee HOA statutes. Gerald hadn't just been petty. He'd been sloppy. And sloppy, Marcus now understood, meant vulnerable. But lawsuits were expensive, slow, and uncertain. Marcus had learned enough about HOA governance to know there was a more direct path, one that didn't require a courtroom, didn't require years of litigation, and didn't leave the underlying problem in place even if it succeeded. He started talking to his neighbors. Not loudly, not publicly, quietly, carefully, one conversation at a time. He knocked on doors on weekend afternoons with a simple opening line. I just wanted to introduce myself properly and ask how things have been going for you here." What he heard, house after house, was a variation of his own story. The retired couple on Elmwood Court who had stopped opening violation envelopes because the anxiety wasn't worth it at their age. The young family on Birch Circle who were seriously considering selling at a loss just to escape. The single mother on Maple Drive who had paid over $2,000 in fines in 18 months and was quietly terrified of what came next. Everyone was exhausted. Everyone was beaten down. Everyone had assumed they were alone. Nobody had ever thought to look left and right and realize that the neighbor who also looked tired, also checked the mailbox with that same slight hesitation, also parked their car with that same unnecessary precision, was fighting the exact same battle. By the end of year 3, Marcus Reed had stopped being an angry homeowner. He had become something far more dangerous to Gerald Hoffman and his board. He had become organized. There's a specific kind of clarity that only comes after you've been pushed far enough. Not the hot, reactive clarity of anger. That one burns fast and leads you somewhere reckless. Not the foggy, exhausted clarity of someone who's simply run out of fight. This was something colder, quieter, more dangerous than either. It was the clarity of a man who had finally stopped asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and started asking, "How do I end this permanently?" Marcus Reed sat at his kitchen table on a Sunday night in October of year 3, both binders open in front of him, his spreadsheet pulled up on his laptop, a legal notepad beside it covered in his own handwriting. Dana had gone to bed. The kids were asleep. The house was completely quiet, and for the first time in 3 years, Marcus wasn't stressed. He was thinking. The research had started 18 months earlier, quietly, methodically. The way Marcus approached everything that mattered to him. He hadn't announced it, hadn't told Dana the full scope of what he was doing, because he didn't want to get her hopes up until he had something real. He'd simply started spending his evenings the way other men spent theirs, watching television, reading Tennessee HOA statutes, community association governance law, homeowner rights documentation, court cases involving HOA disputes in Tennessee and neighboring states, academic papers on community association reform, legal blogs written by attorneys who specialized in exactly this corner of property law. He read everything he could find, and the more he read, the more a single foundational truth crystallized with absolute clarity. An HOA is not a government. It is a private corporation, and like every corporation, it derives its authority entirely from documents. Change the documents, or remove the people misusing them, and the authority disappears. That was the key. Not a lawsuit, not a complaint to a regulatory body, not years of expensive litigation that might or might not go his way, while Gerald's board continued operating in the meantime. The key was the governance structure itself. Tennessee state law was more homeowner-friendly than most people realized. This was the thing that Patricia Voss, the real estate attorney Marcus had consulted 3 times over the previous year, had helped him understand most clearly. Most homeowners assumed HOAs were untouchable, semi-governmental bodies with powers close enough to legal authority that fighting them directly was futile. Gerald Hoffman had certainly cultivated that impression carefully over 6 years. But the law told a completely different story. Under Tennessee Code Annotated, HOA board members were elected positions, chosen by a vote of all homeowners in the community. Not appointed, not permanent, not protected. Any homeowner in good standing had the legal right to run for a board seat during the annual election. Any homeowner could nominate themselves. Any homeowner could campaign. Marcus had been paying his HOA dues consistently for 3 years, even while those dues funded the very board persecuting him. An irony he had not missed, which meant he was legally in good standing. He had every right to place his name on the ballot. That was the first piece. The second piece was dissolution. Tennessee law included a specific provision allowing an HOA to be formally dissolved if a sufficient supermajority of homeowners voted in favor, and if the association could be demonstrated to have operated outside its legal authority in ways that violated either its own governing documents or state statutes. Marcus had spent months building exactly that case. The documentation was extensive. Fines issued without the legally required written notice periods. Appeals dismissed without proper board review procedures. reserve fund expenditures that hadn't been disclosed to homeowners despite Tennessee's HOA financial transparency requirements. Selective enforcement so thoroughly documented across Marcus's 3 years of records that it constituted a provable, systematic pattern. Not isolated incidents, not honest mistakes, but deliberate discriminatory application of community standards. Patricia Voss had reviewed Marcus's complete documentation file during their third consultation. She'd been quiet for a long time afterward. Then she'd looked up and said, "Marcus, if even half of this holds up under scrutiny, you don't just have a strong case. You have grounds for dissolution." Marcus had driven home from that meeting with his hand steady on the wheel and a plan beginning to take full shape in his mind. But legal groundwork alone wasn't enough. Marcus understood that clearly. A dissolution vote required homeowner participation, real, meaningful, substantial participation from a community that had spent years being conditioned into silence and compliance. You couldn't win that kind of vote without people, and people who had been systematically beaten down by an authority figure for years didn't mobilize easily. They needed trust. They needed leadership. They needed someone to show them that the risk of standing up was smaller than the cost of staying silent. That was the work Marcus turned to next. It started with a retired couple on Elmwood Court, Paul and Eleanor Marsh, both in their late 60s, who had lived in Maplewood Estates for 11 years and had accumulated more violation notices than anyone in the neighborhood. Eleanor had developed what her doctor called situational anxiety, that she privately traced directly to the stress of the HOA harassment. Paul had stopped attending any community events because being in the same space as Gerald Hoffman made his blood pressure spike. Marcus knocked on their door on a Saturday afternoon with nothing more than genuine curiosity and a listening ear. He didn't pitch anything. He didn't reveal his plan. He just asked how they were doing and then actually listened to the answer. An hour and a half later, when he finally stood up to leave, Paul walked him to the door and said quietly, "If someone ever figured out a way to do something about all this, Eleanor and I would want to know about it." Marcus noted it, moved on to the next door. The young family on Birch Circle, Jamie and Reese Calloway, both in their early 30s, with 2 kids the same ages as Marcus's, were closer to the edge than anyone. Reese had already started casually browsing real estate listings in neighboring towns. They were months away from giving up entirely. When Marcus sat with them at their kitchen table and laid out, carefully, specifically, with documentation, what the board had actually been doing and what the law actually allowed homeowners to do about it, Reese started crying. Not from sadness, from relief. "We thought we were crazy," she said. "We thought we were the only ones." That moment, more than any legal research, more than any consultation with Patricia Voss, more than any entry in any spreadsheet, cemented for Marcus exactly why this fight was worth having. The coalition grew slowly, and then all at once. Marcus created a private group chat, no HOA-connected platforms, no neighborhood social media pages where Gerald's allies might see it. He was careful about who he invited and in what order, reading each neighbor's situation carefully before approaching them. He didn't want panic. He didn't want leaks. He wanted a quiet, organized, legally grounded movement that Gerald Hoffman would never see coming until it was too late to stop. By November, the group had 34 households. By December, 51. By January, 4 months after Marcus had sat alone at that kitchen table with 2 binders and a legal notepad, 67 households representing more than a third of Maplewood Estates were part of a coordinated effort that Gerald Hoffman had absolutely no idea existed. Marcus held meetings in his backyard on weekend afternoons, framed casually as neighborhood gatherings for anyone who drove past. He presented the legal documentation clearly and without exaggeration. He walked neighbors through their rights under Tennessee law. He answered every question carefully and honestly, including the hard ones about risk, about retaliation, about what happened if the plan failed. He collected written testimonials from 31 households detailing their own experiences with the board. He cross-referenced their violation histories against the HOA's own records, obtained through a formal homeowner information request that Gerald's board was legally required to fulfill, and built a comparative analysis that demonstrated, conclusively and irrefutably, that enforcement actions were concentrated on a specific subset of homeowners in patterns that correlated with nothing except Gerald's personal relationships. It was, Patricia Voss told him when she reviewed the completed file, one of the most thorough homeowner documentation cases she had seen in 15 years of practice. Then Marcus filed his candidacy for the HOA board. Gerald heard about it through the neighborhood grapevine 3 days later. Marcus knew this because a mutual neighbor reported back that Gerald had laughed, genuinely, dismissively laughed, and said something about how some people just couldn't accept how things worked. Marcus heard that and felt nothing except a quiet, settled certainty, because Gerald Hoffman was still playing the game he'd always played, the one where he held all the power and everyone else eventually gave up. He had no idea that the board he'd controlled for 6 years was already gone. He just didn't know it yet. Gerald Hoffman had run unopposed for 6 consecutive years. Let that sink in for a moment. 6 years, 72 months, 312 weeks of holding absolute authority over a community of more than 200 households, over people's homes, their finances, their daily lives, without a single person ever standing up and saying, "I'd like that job instead." Not because Gerald was beloved, not because he was exceptionally qualified, not because the homeowners of Maplewood Estates genuinely believed he was the best person for the role, but because nobody had ever bothered to challenge him, because the annual HOA meeting had become such a reliable formality, such a predictable, low-attendance, rubber-stamp exercise, that the concept of a real election had simply ceased to exist in anyone's imagination. Gerald hadn't built an empire through excellence. He'd built it through everyone else's exhaustion, and for 6 years, that had been more than enough. The annual meeting was scheduled for the second Tuesday of February in the Maplewood Estates Community Center, the same beige-carpeted, fluorescent-lit conference room where every HOA meeting for the past decade had taken place. Folding tables arranged in a rectangle, plastic chairs, a podium Gerald had purchased with HOA funds 3 years earlier that nobody had ever questioned. Gerald arrived 20 minutes early, as he always did. He set up the agenda packets, arranged the voting materials, exchanged a few words with his 2 remaining board allies, Janet Pruitt, who handled the violation notice administration, and Ron Decker, who managed the reserve fund with a level of transparency that would have troubled any forensic accountant who looked closely enough. By the time the meeting was scheduled to begin, there were 11 people in the room, a perfectly normal turnout. Gerald surveyed the familiar faces, the same retirees, the same handful of genuinely civic-minded neighbors, and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has confused the absence of opposition for the presence of respect. Then the door opened again, and kept opening. They came in 1s and 2s, and small groups, neighbors who had never attended an HOA meeting in their lives, young families who had moved into Maplewood Estates during Gerald's tenure and spent years assuming that this was simply how things were, retired couples who had stopped fighting years ago but had quietly, carefully decided that tonight was different. 74 homeowners. The room filled past capacity within 15 minutes. Folding chairs were dragged in from the storage closet. People stood along the walls. The small hallway outside the double doors filled with residents craning their necks to see inside. Gerald stood at the podium and watched it happen with an expression Marcus would later describe, carefully, precisely, as a man who had just realized mid-sentence that the word coming out of his mouth was wrong but couldn't stop himself from finishing it. He recognized some faces, didn't recognize others, noticed, with a dawning unease, he was working hard not to show, that the energy in the room was unlike anything he had felt in 6 years of running these meetings. This was not the energy of civic obligation. This was the energy of people who had been waiting for something. Gerald opened a meeting on schedule, followed the standard agenda with practiced efficiency, called the room to order, moved through procedural items, approval of last year's minutes, treasurer's report, maintenance updates, with the brisk confidence of someone who considers the formal portion of the meeting an inconvenient preamble to the inevitable outcome. He called for board nominations. Janet Pruitt nominated Gerald, as she had every year for 6 consecutive terms. Ron Decker seconded, as he always did. Gerald waited for the familiar silence that followed, the moment where the absence of other nominations confirmed what everyone already knew. Instead, a hand went up in the 3rd row. Marcus Reed stood up. He was calm, completely, almost unnervingly calm. He was dressed neatly, his documentation binder closed on the chair beside him, his expression carrying none of the anger or agitation that Gerald might have anticipated and known how to handle. He looked, Gerald would later tell someone privately, like a man who had already won and was simply going through the remaining steps as a formality. Marcus nominated himself, then nominated his 2 coalition candidates for the remaining open seats. Gerald's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He acknowledged the nominations with procedural correctness because he had no legal choice. Then he said, with the particular condescension of someone who has never been genuinely threatened, "The floor is open for any statements before we proceed to the vote." Marcus stood up again. 47 minutes. That was how long Marcus Reed spoke to the assembled homeowners of Maplewood Estates. And in those 47 minutes, he did not raise his voice once, did not perform outrage, did not appeal to emotion before he had thoroughly, exhaustively, irrefutably appealed to evidence. He presented the violation pattern data, 156 notices to one household over 3 years, while comparable conditions on other streets went uncited. He presented the financial irregularities, reserve fund expenditures that violated the HOA's own spending authorization procedures. He presented the procedural violations, appeals dismissed without the documentation required under Tennessee state law, fines issued without the mandatory written notice periods the statutes required. He presented testimony from 31 households, written, signed, dated, describing their own experiences with selective enforcement and financial harassment. He presented Patricia Voss's legal analysis, concluding that the board had operated outside its lawful authority in ways that were documented, provable, and actionable. And then he sat down. The room was absolutely silent for a long moment. Then it wasn't. The vote that followed was not close. It was not tense. It was not the nail-biting, could-go-either-way moment that the word election usually implies. It was a landslide so decisive, 61 votes for Marcus, 9 for Gerald, that it felt less like a democratic outcome and more like a community exhaling all at once after 6 years of holding its breath. Gerald Hoffman collected his agenda packets from the podium table with hands that Marcus noticed were not entirely steady. He did not speak to anyone, did not make eye contact, walked through the crowd, which parted for him not with hostility, but with the quiet, final indifference of people who have simply moved on, and left the community center. The door closed behind him, and for the first time in 6 years, the homeowners of Maplewood Estates looked at each other across a room they finally, completely owned. Winning the election was not the end. Marcus knew that before he ever filed his candidacy. He had known it during every backyard meeting, every late-night research session, every quiet conversation with Patricia Voss about Tennessee HOA law. Removing Gerald Hoffman from the board was necessary, but it was not sufficient, because a board could be replaced and then slowly, gradually, over years, corrupted again. New faces, same structure, same power concentrated in the same small group of people with the same capacity for abuse. Marcus hadn't spent 3 years building this case to install himself as the new Gerald Hoffman. He had spent 3 years building it to make sure no Gerald Hoffman could ever happen in Maplewood Estates again. That meant dissolution, complete, legal, permanent dissolution of the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association. And the clock was already running. The morning after the election, Marcus called Patricia Voss. She answered on the second ring. He suspected she'd been waiting for the call. He told her the results. She was quiet for a moment and then said, with the measured satisfaction of someone who had reviewed 3 years of documented misconduct and knew exactly what it was worth, "Then let's finish it." The legal framework for dissolution had been prepared months in advance. Patricia had drafted the formal petition documentation, the required homeowner notification materials, and the evidentiary summary that would accompany the dissolution vote, a comprehensive document outlining the board's history of operating outside its legal authority under Tennessee state statutes. Under Tennessee law, HOA dissolution required a supermajority vote of all homeowners in the community, not just those who attended a meeting, but a formal ballot process that gave every household in Maplewood Estates the opportunity to participate. The threshold was high by design. State legislators had written dissolution law conservatively, recognizing that HOAs, whatever their flaws, represented shared infrastructure and community agreements that couldn't be casually unwound. Marcus respected that threshold. He had no interest in shortcuts. He had 67 households already organized and committed. Maplewood Estates had 211 total households. He needed a supermajority, which meant he needed to reach beyond his coalition, into the quieter corners of the neighborhood, the households that hadn't joined the group chat, the homeowners who had suffered in silence without ever connecting with anyone else who felt the same way. He had 60 days to get there. The campaign, because that is genuinely what it became, was the most intensive 60 days of Marcus Reed's life outside of those 11 years of saving for the house itself. He and his 2 new board members divided the neighborhood into thirds. Every household received a formal written notice of the dissolution vote, as required by law, along with a plain language summary of what dissolution meant practically. What would happen to the community pool, the common areas, the shared maintenance responsibilities that the HOA currently managed? Marcus had anticipated that these practical questions would be the biggest source of hesitation. People understood, almost universally, that Gerald's board had been abusive, but understanding that the institution was broken and trusting that life without it would actually be better were 2 different things. Some neighbors had lived under HOA governance for so long that the idea of the neighborhood functioning without it felt genuinely disorienting. So Marcus answered every question, personally, directly, as many times as it needed answering. He held 3 town hall meetings in his backyard over those 60 days. Larger versions of the quiet coalition gatherings that had built the movement in the first place, now open to the entire neighborhood. He brought Patricia Voss to the second one, and she spent 2 hours walking homeowners through exactly what dissolution looked like legally, financially, and practically. What happened to the reserve fund? How common area maintenance would be handled through a transition agreement. What homeowners' individual property rights looked like on the other side. The retired couple on Elmwood Court, Paul and Eleanor Marsh, became unexpected ambassadors. Eleanor, whose situational anxiety had been documented by her own physician as directly connected to HOA stress, spoke at the 3rd town hall with a quiet, unadorned honesty that moved the room in ways that legal arguments simply couldn't. She talked about what it felt like to dread your own mailbox, about the years of small humiliations, about what it would mean, what it would actually, physically feel like, to live in her home without that weight. There was not a dry eye in Marcus's backyard that evening. The formal ballot was distributed to all 211 households on a Tuesday morning in the 7th week. Homeowners had 7 days to return their votes, by mail, by hand delivery to a secure ballot box placed at the community center entrance, or electronically through a verified online portal that Patricia's office had arranged. Marcus did not sleep well during those 7 days, not because he doubted the outcome. The coalition alone represented a significant portion of the required supermajority, and the town halls had expanded support well beyond those original 67 households. But because 3 years of fighting an opponent who played dirty had taught him to never assume victory until it was officially, irreversibly confirmed. He checked the ballot return numbers every morning, watched the participation rate climb, said nothing publicly about projections or expectations. On the 8th day, Patricia Voss's office conducted the official count. 171 ballots returned out of 211 households, an 81% participation rate that shattered every previous record for homeowner engagement in Maplewood Estates history. Of those 171 ballots, 139 voted in favor of dissolution, 81.3%. The supermajority threshold had not just been met, it had been exceeded by a margin that left absolutely no room for legal challenge, no grounds for appeal, no procedural mechanism through which Gerald Hoffman or anyone else could argue that the result didn't represent the genuine will of the community. The Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association was officially, legally, permanently dissolved on a Friday afternoon in late spring. Every pending violation notice, including the 23 that Gerald's board had issued in the weeks between the election and the dissolution vote, apparently determined to squeeze every last dollar out of the process until the very end, was canceled and wiped from the record. Every outstanding fine was nullified. The reserve fund, $47,000 accumulated over years of homeowner dues, was redistributed proportionally to all 211 households. The management contract with Gerald's preferred property management company was terminated effective immediately, and Marcus Reed drove home that Friday evening, parked his car in his driveway, slightly over the line, deliberately, for the first time in 3 years, walked to his mailbox, and found nothing inside except a furniture catalog and a water bill. He stood there for a long moment in the late afternoon light. Then he went inside, made 2 cups of coffee, handed one to Dana, and they sat together on the porch, the same porch where this whole story had really begun, and watched the neighborhood settle into a quiet Friday evening. No yellow envelopes, no violation notices. Marcus Reed didn't become an activist. He didn't start a podcast, didn't launch a legal consulting business, didn't spend his weekends traveling to other neighborhoods, telling his story at community meetings. He wasn't built for that kind of spotlight, and he knew it. What he did was simpler, more personal, more true to exactly who he had always been. He went back to drinking his coffee on the porch on Saturday mornings. That was it. That was the victory lap. A ceramic mug, a quiet street, and the particular quality of morning light that falls differently when you're not carrying 3 years of accumulated dread on your shoulders. Dana would join him sometimes. The kids would spill out eventually, loud and unhurried, the way kids are when their home feels safe. Neighbors would wave from driveways. Nobody flinched at the sight of a yellow envelope anymore, because yellow envelopes no longer existed. It sounds small. It was everything. But Marcus had learned things during those 3 years that he couldn't unknow. And he believed, genuinely, deeply believed, that those lessons belonged to more people than just him. So before we close this story, let's talk about what he actually learned. Not the legal tactics, not the specific Tennessee statutes, the deeper lessons, the ones that apply whether you live in Maplewood Estates or Montana, or anywhere in between where a small group of people have decided that authority is something they're entitled to rather than something they've earned. The first lesson is the one most people learn too late. An HOA is not a government. Read that again. Sit with it. It is not a municipality. It is not a regulatory body. It does not have police powers. It does not have the inherent authority of an elected government accountable to voters and constitutional law. It is a private corporation created by a developer, governed by documents, and powered entirely by the passivity of the homeowners who fall under its jurisdiction. Every ounce of authority an HOA board possesses exists only because homeowners either granted it through their governing documents or surrendered it through their silence. The moment homeowners collectively decide to exercise the rights those same documents give them, the right to vote, the right to run for office, the right to demand financial transparency, the right to pursue dissolution, the board's power doesn't diminish. It evaporates. Gerald Hoffman was powerful for 6 years for one reason, and one reason only. Nobody organized against him. Not because they couldn't, because they didn't know they could, because the system he'd built was specifically designed to make people feel like they couldn't. The moment Marcus Reed proved that they could, the power was gone overnight. The second lesson is about documentation. If you are currently in a dispute with an HOA board, start a binder tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Every violation notice, every fine receipt, every piece of correspondence, every email. Photograph your property weekly. Note dates, times, and exact conditions. Cross-reference your violations against your neighbor's properties and note identical conditions that are never cited. Documentation is not paranoia. Documentation is power. Marcus's binders, those 2 thick, overstuffed collections of yellow envelopes and spreadsheet printouts and appeal letters, were not the record of a victim. They were the architectural blueprints of a legal case that dissolved a corrupt institution. Every entry he made at his kitchen table at 11 p.m., when he would rather have been sleeping, became a brick in the wall that eventually brought Gerald Hoffman's entire operation down. You cannot fight what you cannot prove. Prove everything. The third lesson is about your neighbors. The most dangerous thing Gerald Hoffman ever did, more dangerous than any individual fine, more damaging than any specific violation notice, was successfully convince each household in Maplewood Estates that they were alone. Isolation is the oldest tool of institutional control. If every person in a community believes they are the only one suffering, nobody compares notes. Nobody organizes. Nobody realizes that the retired couple 3 doors down and the young family across the street and the single mother on the next block are all living inside the same story. Marcus's single most powerful act was not filing his candidacy. It was not presenting 47 minutes of evidence at the annual meeting. It was knocking on doors on Saturday afternoons and simply asking, "How have things been going for you here?" That question, asked sincerely, received honestly, built a coalition of 67 households that Gerald never saw coming, because Gerald had never imagined that the people he'd spent years isolating would ever find each other. Find your neighbors. You are not alone. You never were. The fourth and final lesson is the hardest one. It requires something most people, understandably, reasonably, given everything they've been through, find almost impossible to hold onto after years of being targeted and exhausted and financially drained. It requires patience. Marcus Reed did not dissolve the Maplewood Estates HOA in a week. He did not do it in a month. He did it over 3 years of documentation, 18 months of legal research, 4 months of coalition building, 60 days of formal campaigning, and 1 very long Friday afternoon waiting for ballot results. The people who win these fights are not always the loudest. They are not always the most aggressive. They are not always the ones with the most resources, or the best lawyers, or the most righteous anger. They are the ones who outlast. They are the ones who stay organized when the other side expects them to give up, who keep documenting when the other side expects them to stop, who knock on one more door when every reasonable instinct says they've done enough. They are the ones who understand, deeply, patiently, with the settled certainty of someone who has read every statute and filled every binder and built every coalition, that institutions built on abuse are not actually strong. They just look strong from the outside, push the right way, with the right preparation, at the right moment, and they fall. Marcus Reed pushed. And Maplewood Estates, all 211 households, all those Saturday mornings, all those porches and driveways and flower pots and welcome mats, is free. If your HOA is treating you the way Gerald Hoffman treated Marcus Reed, drop your story in the comments. Every single one gets read. And if this video helped you understand that you have more power than you think, share it with every homeowner you know. Because somewhere out there, someone is standing at their mailbox, right now holding a yellow envelope. They need to see this. Fire like, subscribe, share. Let's make sure they find it.